Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, could you do me a favor? If you enjoy this story, if it makes you think, feel, or even just drift off to sleep, hit the like button and make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It really does help more than you know. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Which city? Which country? Is it late where you are? Midnight? 3 a.m.? Are you watching this under warm blankets while the world outside sleeps? I read every comment. I always do. And I love knowing where you're listening from. Now, settle in. Close your eyes if you want. Let your breathing slow. Because tonight, we're going back in time. Not to castles and fairy tales. Not to ballads sung by wandering bards. But to something darker. Something quieter. The story no one tells the horrifying truth about being a bride in the Middle Ages. They paint it with lace and garlands now. They call it tradition, romance. But in truth, it was duty. It was fear. It was control. To be a bride in medieval Europe was to be a transaction, not a celebration. Your wedding wasn't the start of a love story. It was the closing of a deal, signed by fathers, sealed with dowries, and carried out with eyes averted. You were promised, often before your body even knew what promise meant. At 12, 13, sometimes younger, you might not have met your husband until the day you were led to him, wrapped in layers of wool and obligation. They said it was holy. That marriage was a sacred bond. But they never told you how it felt to be bartered like grain, evaluated like livestock, measured by purity and obedience. Not by laughter, not by kindness, not by who you hoped to become. If you were lucky, your husband was only twice your age. If you were less lucky, he was 50. A widower, a warlord, a man who wanted heirs more than a partner. And that was your role, to bear children, to serve in silence, to endure. Your wedding day wasn't filled with flowers and speeches. It was filled with blood. Blood on the sheets. Blood on your thighs. Proof. Proof that you were untouched, unspoiled, virginal. If the blood didn't appear, the consequences could be public. Accusations, shame, annulment, or worse. In some regions, the stained sheet was paraded through town like a trophy. In others, elders waited outside the bridal chamber to hear the sounds. And if you were afraid, if your body trembled or locked up or bled too much, they said you were weak, that you dishonored the union. No one asked if you were ready. No one asked if you wanted this. Readiness didn't matter. Consent was not a word they used. Not in the vows, not in the laws, not in the prayers. Your name changed. Your house changed. Your body became his. And with it, your future. You could not own land. You could not inherit titles. You could not testify against your husband. You were his shadow, his possession, his legacy machine. And if you failed to conceive, if your belly remained flat and your womb quiet, you were blamed. You were cursed, a bad omen. Some were sent back, others locked away, some disappeared, a few died. Quietly, forgotten, a failed investment. If you did bear children, you did so in pain, in filth, in risk. There were no doctors, only midwives and whispered charms. You lay on rush-covered floors, biting down on cloth, praying not to bleed too much, hoping the child would live, hoping you would live. And if you didn't, well, there were always more girls to marry off, to replace you. The church said this was holy. That woman was made for man. That obedience was virtue. They read it from pulpits, etched it into stone, preached it over your body while it shook and tore and broke. They said your silence was noble, that your suffering was proof of grace. And when you cried, they told you to be still, to be grateful, to be blessed. But being a bride in the Middle Ages was not a blessing. It was a sentence, a beautiful cage wrapped in ritual and rosemary. A performance of joy worn like a mask over a face that learned not to flinch. You were dressed in colors not to celebrate, but to signal. Red for wealth, blue for purity, green for fertility. But no one cared what you liked. No one asked what you dreamed of. The clothes were chosen for you, the feast planned without your voice. The bed prepared by strangers, You were moved like furniture, decorated like property. And when your husband drank too much or struck you or took what you didn't want to give, you were told to pray harder, to serve better, to be more obedient. Love was never part of the contract. It was a luxury, a myth, a word for poets and fools. Your job was to endure, and you did. They all did, with bruises hidden beneath sleeves, with teeth clenched through childbirth, with songs hummed to babies while their fathers hunted or fought or drank. Some tried to escape. Some ran to convents. Some vanished into woods, into rivers, into silence. And some learned to survive, to bend without breaking, to find pockets of peace in gardens, in books, in whispered conversations with other women who knew, who saw, who remembered what they once wanted, who still carried the echo of a laugh that was theirs, before the vows, before the veil. But the truth remained, the terrifying truth, that being a bride in the Middle Ages was not the beginning of a story. It was the end of yours, rewritten in someone else's hand, with ink you could never hold. They tell fairy tales now of princesses saved by marriage, of love sealed with a kiss. But real brides weren't kissed, they were claimed. And behind every wedding bell, every garland, every painted ceiling there was a girl who once dared to dream and was taught not to. That's what we'll talk about tonight. Gently, honestly, quietly, because their voices were never written down. But we can remember them, we can speak for them, we can listen. And that is where the story truly begins. They told you that marriage would make you a woman, but they never told you what it would take away. You woke up on your wedding day not with joy, but with a silence so deep it made your hands tremble. The women around you were already moving, their voices low, their hands busy with pins and laces and oils that smelled of lavender and ash. You did not speak, you did not cry. You simply sat as they wrapped you in fabric you did not choose, pressed rosemary into your palms for fertility, tied ribbons into your hair and called it beauty. They told you to smile. Not because you felt joy, but because a bride who frowns is a bad omen. You were dressed like an offering, like something to be given, to be unwrapped, to be proven. They whispered prayers, not for your happiness, but for your obedience. Not for your love, but for your purity. And as they walked you to the chapel, to the altar, to the man you barely knew, the ground beneath your feet felt like stone pulled from a grave. He waited with a smirk, or a yawn, or the look of a man who already saw you as his. The priest read words you barely heard, vows spoken in a language you had no voice in. You said, "I do," not because you understood, but because it was time, because everyone was watching, because to say no was to ruin the family. And when the crowd cheered, when the bells rang, when hands clapped and petals fell, you didn't feel married. You felt owned. The feast was loud. Laughter, meat, spilled wine, jokes told at your expense, songs about maidenhood lost and manhood proven. Old women nudged each other. Men shouted to your husband to make sure you bled right, to teach her well. You smiled, you nodded. You drank what they gave you. And when the night came, and the bed was waiting, and the sheets were white, you walked to your chamber like a lamb to the altar. Not because you wanted to, because you had to. You were undressed not with care, but with expectation. You were touched, not with tenderness, but with claim. If you cried, it was ignored. If you hesitated, it was punished. If you bled, it was celebrated. If you didn't, it was questioned. And if it hurt, and it did, you were told that pain was part of womanhood. That pain meant it worked. That pain was proof. And when it was done, he rolled away, or fell asleep, or left the room. And you lay there staring at the ceiling, the candles flickering like distant eyes, your body sore, your soul folded in on itself. You were no longer a girl, but you were not free. You were not even seen. In the morning, you were expected to serve. To rise early, light the fire, prepare his food, tend to his garments, bow your head. To smile when his mother visited. To stand still during sermons. To pretend the bruises were clumsiness, the silence was respect. You learned quickly. How to count coins. how to spin wool, how to pour wine without spilling, how to carry grief in your spine without letting it reach your voice. You were praised when you were quiet, punished when you asked too much. And when the first missed bleeding came, the house changed. His eyes watched you differently. The midwife was summoned. The prayers changed. They asked for boys, for heirs, for strength in your womb. Not for your safety, not for your peace, just for results. And when you did give birth, whether in blood or tears or terror, you were praised again. Not as a mother, but as a vessel, a successful vessel, a fulfilled bride. And then they left you alone to clean the afterbirth, to soothe cracked nipples, to rock a screaming infant while your body still tore with pain. If the child lived, it was his. If it died, it was your fault. And you did it again and again and again, because that was the rhythm. That was the role. That was the sentence. Some days he was kind. Some days he wasn't. Some days you felt like a wife. Others like a servant. But never like yourself. That name, that girl, that laugh you once had, it faded. You became known only in relation to him, as his. And if he died, you became property again. Passed to his brother, his son, the church. If you bore only daughters, you were pitied. If you bore too many, you were scolded. If you bore none, you were cursed. Every part of you was weighed, evaluated, measured against a standard no one explained. And yet, you endured. You found moments, fleeting ones, a smile from your child, the warmth of sun on your hands while hanging linens, a look from the kitchen girl that said she saw you, even if no one else did. You whispered stories to yourself while grinding herbs. You remembered your mother's voice, a song, a scent, a field behind your old home. You didn't forget. You couldn't. That was your rebellion, quiet memory, private joy, secret self. They never suspected. They never looked closely enough. And you never gave them a reason to. That was survival. And you were so good at it. But in the quiet at night, when even the wind held its breath, you remembered who you were, and you mourned her, gently, as if she were a friend who went missing. And maybe she was. But somewhere deep, beneath the bruises and the silence and the vows, you still breathed. You still existed. And maybe, just maybe, you were waiting. Not for rescue, not for love, but for a moment, a chance, a whisper of change. And until then, you endured. Because that's what brides did. Not in poems, not in fairy tales, but in kitchens, in cellars, in silence, every single day. You learn to listen more than you speak, to watch the room before you move, to read your husband's face the way others read scripture, searching for signs, warnings, shifts in tone. A furrow of his brow meant silence. A sigh meant distance. An empty cup meant hurry. And your body responded without thought, because thought was dangerous. Thought meant questions. Questions meant defiance. Defiance meant consequence. So you adapted. You smiled at the right moments. Laughed softly when the men made crude jokes about brides and beds. You lowered your eyes when the priest spoke of obedience, of the woman as the weaker vessel, of Eve's curse and your duty to carry it with grace. You stood beside him at the church steps on feast days, your hands folded, your shoulders still, while inside, your ribs ached from holding everything in. You became a painting, something still, soft, sacred, but never real. Not to them. Not to yourself. Because being a bride wasn't a single day, it was a lifelong performance. And the role never ended. If your husband rose in station, you were expected to rise with him gracefully, silently, bearing more children, hosting more guests, offering your smile like bread and your presence like proof that the household was righteous. If he fell, you fell harder. You bore the weight of his debt, his anger, his shame. And if he died, you wore black, not for mourning, but for ownership. You became a widow, and widows were watched, feared, pitied. You were expected to vanish into your veil, to live in the shadows, to avoid laughter, red thread, perfume, anything that made you seem alive. Because aliveness meant danger. It meant you could want. And wanting in a woman was always a threat, so you hid it. You mourned not only him, but yourself, again, because now you were a relic, a reminder, a piece of property that had outlived its owner. And if you were still young, they warned you, don't smile too much. Don't walk alone. Don't speak freely. Don't be seen. Because a widow with breath and beauty was considered a temptation, a loose thread in the moral fabric. And if you didn't remarry, and many did not, you lived in limbo, neither girl nor wife. Just spare. They said you were lucky, that being married had saved you, protected you from shame, given you worth. But you knew better. You had seen it, in the eyes of the girls not chosen, in the fate of the women who married badly, in the silence of your mother, who had smiled just like you on her wedding day, and now sat with hands that never stopped working and a mouth that rarely opened without prayer. You watched the younger girls coming of age. You saw the way their shoulders tightened when marriage was mentioned. You saw the way they stopped laughing as often, the way their steps became smaller, their questions fewer. They were learning, preparing, folding themselves inward like letters never meant to be read. You wanted to warn them, but you didn't, because no one had warned you, because warning them wouldn't save them, because the walls were too high, the rules too old, the eyes many. So you did what generations had done before. You taught them how to survive. You showed them how to walk with grace, how to serve without being noticed, how to avoid the worst without resisting the expected. You told them how to smile without showing teeth, how to cry at night without making noise, how to hide bruises beneath sleeves, how to answer questions with phrases that said nothing. You passed down survival like a recipe, pinch by pinch, whisper by whisper, not because you wanted this world for them, but because it was the only world there was. And yet, you still dreamed, in the quiet, in the dark, while kneading bread, while combing a child's hair, while walking alone through the orchard. You dreamed of something different, a room of your own, a day without orders, a voice not lowered, a name not erased. You dreamed of standing tall, of being seen, of being heard. And sometimes, when the wind was strong and the house was still and the fire low, you let yourself imagine it, just for a moment, what it might feel like to choose, to walk without permission, to love without obligation, to speak without punishment. And then the baby cried, or the door opened, or your husband called, and the dream vanished, as it always did. And you returned, as you always did, because this was your role, your vow, your veil, your cage. And yet, even in the smallest corners, something stirred. The memory of laughter, the echo of freedom, the pulse of a heart not yet fully silenced. And maybe that was enough to keep breathing, to keep watching, to keep the stories alive. Not the ones in books, not the ones the priests told, but the ones passed from woman to woman, around fires, over looms, between chores. Stories of defiance, of survival, of sisters who ran, of wives who fought, of mothers who refused to be erased. They were whispered, not written, but they endured, just like you. Just like every bride who came before and every bride who would come after. Because even in a world built to silence you, there was still something they couldn't kill. Your memory, your truth, your voice. And tonight, that voice is heard, here, now, with every breath you take. They called it the sanctity of marriage. But sanctity was a word used to cover cruelty with silk. Behind the stone walls of manors and cottages alike, behind the church blessings and feast day celebrations, behind the garlands and veils and sermons about obedience, there was something far colder. Control, not shared, not mutual, but male. From the moment you were betrothed, often while you were still a child, often without your consent, often as part of a bargain that benefited only others, your life was no longer yours. Your name might have changed, but your status did not. You belonged to someone, first your father, then your husband. And if both died and you were childless, the church might claim you, or a cousin, or a baron in need of a steward's widow. you were always on loan. And the body that housed you, your body, was never considered separate from the house it served. You were trained to serve before you were taught to read. And if you were taught to read at all, it was only enough to follow scripture, not to question it, not to interpret it, just to absorb it, to memorize the parts about submission, the verses about wives, the rules about silence, the stories of punishment for women who defied the roles given to them. Jezebel, Eve, Lot's wife. The message was always the same: obedience or ruin. And when you were married, those messages became law. A husband could beat his wife so long as the rod was no thicker than his thumb. It was called correction. It was framed as care. The priests didn't speak against it. The neighbors didn't interfere. If the bruises showed, you were asked what you did to deserve them. And often, you believed it. Because the system was not just enforced by men, it was preserved by everyone. The other women, too, had been trained to endure, and so they taught you the same. How to walk with grace, even with broken ribs. How to smile with a split lip. How to thank the heavens when your husband didn't come home drunk, or angry, or at all. They taught you how to hide, how to keep secrets, how to nod when others whispered that at least you were married, at least you had a roof, at least you weren't like her, the spinster, the scold, the whore. Because those were the only other options: virgin, wife, widow, or disgrace. And the line between each was razor thin. You could fall from grace with one accusation, one rumor, one stain. And stains came easily. A word out of turn, a pregnancy that came too late, or too soon, or not at all, a friend who spoke too freely, a brother who lost your dowry in a bad harvest, a dress hem that rose too high when you bent down to fetch water. The world watched you constantly, not with care, but with judgment. You lived under 1,000 eyes, some human, some divine, all unblinking. You learned to exist in halves, to speak softly, to move slowly, to take up less space, not because you wanted to, but because survival demanded it. You became good at reading silence, at knowing when to leave a room, at anticipating anger before it erupted, at soothing a child while your own hands shook, at cleaning blood from sheets before the servants saw. And when you cried, if you cried, it was never in the open. It was in root cellars, in stables, behind church pews, somewhere dark and private where even God might not look too closely. And still, they called it sacred. They said it was holy, that this was the divine order, that a wife's suffering was a reflection of the virgin's endurance, that motherhood was a blessing, even if it killed you, that submission was your path to salvation. They praised you when you bowed, when you bore sons, when you stayed, especially when you stayed. No matter what was done to you, no matter who you became, and if you didn't stay, if you fled, or resisted, or refused, you were cast out, not just from your home, but from the story, your name erased from records, your face missing from tapestries, your legacy boiled down to one word: troublemaker, temptress, madwoman, or worse, witch. Because the church had many ways of dealing with women who refused the script, and the fire was only one of them. Some were locked away, others shunned, some exorcised, some confined to convents against their will. And even those walls weren't safe. The abbess watched with judgment. The priests visited with demands. The silence there was not peace, it was punishment. And yet many chose it. Because for some, it was the only place left where a woman might find a door that locked from the inside, a room of her own, a space where she wasn't expected to open her legs at command, or her mouth, or her future. You understood this, even if you didn't speak it aloud, because you had thought about it too. What it would mean to leave, to vanish, to start again. But then the child needed you, or the bread needed baking, or the snow fell and the road disappeared. And so you stayed, and every day you stayed, you lost a little more of yourself. Not all at once, just one dream at a time, one song, one memory, one smile that didn't feel forced. And in the end, you weren't sure who you were before the wedding, before the veil, before the first bruise, before the first yes that was really a please don't. But even then, even in that quiet erasure, something inside you burned. A small flame, weak, flickering, but alive. A voice that whispered, when you couldn't sleep, that you were more than this, that you had once climbed trees, that you had once laughed without fear, that you had once believed the world could be yours. And maybe, just maybe, that voice would survive, hidden, waiting, until it was safe to speak again, until it could say, with no fear, no apology, I was here. I mattered. I endured. They said your wedding was the beginning, but it felt more like the end. An end to choice, an end to youth, an end to your name, your voice, your sense of direction. You were now someone's wife, someone's property, someone's silent mirror. You were no longer allowed to wander the village on your own, no longer permitted to laugh too loudly, dance too freely, or rest too long. You woke before the crows and slept only when the house had quieted. Not because you were full of purpose, but because your labor was expected, automatic, invisible. You made the meals. You boiled the water. You mended the holes in tunics worn by the same man who shouted at you for forgetting salt. You tended to children who cried with the same voice you once used when you were small. A voice no one answered then either. You lit the candles for prayers you didn't believe in. You bowed to neighbors who looked through you. You memorized the faces of every bruised apple, every cracked dish, every spill you'd be blamed for, even if it wasn't yours. Your days were spent in a rhythm of tasks that never ended. Fetch the water, boil the rags, fold the linens, feed the chickens, kiss the cheek, hide the wince, apologize for not smiling while exhausted. And in those rare, stolen minutes, alone in the garden, in the privy, by the well, you spoke to yourself in the language of the girl you once were. You whispered her name just to remember it. You let your mouth form the words of songs she used to hum. You let your shoulders soften just for a moment, before stiffening again at the sound of footsteps, because you were never alone. Not really. There were always eyes, from windows, from behind corners, from the sky above, where you were told God was watching, judging, keeping score. And though your body was yours in theory, in practice, it belonged to others. To your husband, to the church, to the community. You had no right to refuse, no right to protect, no right to say, not tonight, or not ever. If you were lucky, he was kind. If you were less lucky, he was brutal. If you were like many, was simply indifferent. You became a tool, an object, a body that cooked, cleaned, produced, and bled. You bled with the moon. You bled in childbirth. You bled in silence. And they never called it sacrifice. They called it nature. They called it duty. They called it being a good wife. When you were pregnant, your belly became public. Women touched it without asking. Men commented on it without shame. Strangers felt entitled to know what you craved, how you slept, whether you carried high or low, whether it would be a boy or a disappointment. And when the time came to give birth, you did so on straw, on bloodied cloth, on a floor that had seen more pain than comfort. You screamed, but not too loudly. You cried, but not too much. Because good women didn't show fear. Good women knew pain was their calling. And if the baby died, you were told it was God's will. And if you died, it was the price of womanhood. And if both of you lived, you were expected to smile, to be grateful, to start preparing for the next one. Because you were not meant to rest, not ever. The midwives brought herbs. The priest brought prayers. No one brought silence. No one brought comfort. And your husband, if he came at all, stood like a visitor, not a witness, like a man checking the quality of his purchase. And when the child cried and your breasts leaked and your back ached and your vision blurred from exhaustion, there were no congratulations. There were questions. Is it a boy? Is he strong? Will he survive? Will he serve? Because daughters were burdens. Daughters were dowries waiting to be spent. Daughters were versions of you, waiting to be erased all over again. And yet, When you held her, if you had a daughter, you felt something else. Not just fear, not just sorrow, but fury. A quiet fire that burned beneath your bones. A vow you could never say aloud, that she would know more, that she would run if she could, that she would not be softened into obedience so easily. And even though you knew the world would come for her too, you held that fire, because it was all you had. They spoke often of honor, of legacy, of keeping the family line pure, but legacy was just another word for repetition. And honor was a weight placed on your shoulders while they drank and laughed and prayed for your submission. You carried the honor, you carried the shame, you were the shield, the scapegoat, the story. And when the family failed, it was your fault. When he drank too much, it was because you weren't sweet enough. When the children misbehaved, it was because you were too lenient. When the house was cold, it was your laziness. You apologized with your body, you made amends with your hands. You atoned through silence, and you survived through invisibility. And still beneath all that you remained, bent, not broken, quiet, not erased, a breath, a whisper, a presence, not because they allowed it, but because you refused to disappear. Even if they never said your name again, even if they buried you beneath a stone too cheap to carve, even if your children remembered only your cooking and not your voice, you were there, you lived, you endured, and that, in the end, was the most defiant thing of all. You never called it survival, not out loud, but that's what it was. Every day a quiet battle, not with swords or shields or screaming foes, but with silence, with custom, with the slow erosion of self beneath the weight of tradition. You learned to be small, not in size, but in presence. To be efficient, useful, unobtrusive. You learned how to enter a room without drawing attention, how to pour ale without spilling a drop, how to nod at the right time and speak only when spoken to. You mastered the art of waiting, waiting for your husband to come home, waiting for the bread to rise, waiting for your body to heal, waiting for permission, waiting to matter. You watched yourself fade in the eyes of others long before you saw it in the mirror. And even then, the reflection felt strange, like a costume you never chose. The girl who used to run through fields, who used to hum songs under her breath, who once looked at the stars and imagined other lives, she was still there, somewhere, but buried under layers of duty and fear, and the kind of tiredness that didn't go away with sleep. They called you blessed. They pointed to your ring, your children, your hearth, and said, "She has everything a woman should want." But you knew what they meant. She has what keeps her quiet. What keeps her in line? What keeps her from asking for more? You watched other women, two older ones, younger ones, ones who hadn't yet married, ones who'd married too many times. You saw the patterns. You saw the lines in their faces, not from age, but from holding too much in for too long. You heard the way they sighed when they thought no one was listening. You noticed the tremble in their hands, the way they stiffened when their husbands raised their voices, the way they flinched at sudden laughter. And you understood, because you carried those same ghosts. You heard them in your bones. You felt them in your hips, in your knees, in the ache behind your eyes that never fully left. The world said you were safe now, but it didn't feel like safety. It felt like confinement, like a life shaped by what you were allowed to do, not what you wanted to do. You remembered stories from your girlhood of queens and saints and brave women who defied kings. But as you grew older, you learned what happened to them. The queen was locked away. The saint was burned. The brave woman vanished from the record. Their names faded, rewritten, twisted. The world remembered them only as warnings, not heroes. And so you stopped dreaming of bravery. You started dreaming of quiet rebellion, a soft kind, the kind that left no trace, a recipe shared in secret, a book read by candlelight, a smile at the market boy who reminded you of freedom. You dreamed of hiding coins, of tracing maps, of one day walking away and never looking back. Not to abandon, not to destroy, just to breathe, just to exist for yourself. And when those dreams hurt too much, you focused on the small things, the warmth of dough between your fingers, the smell of your child's hair, the feeling of wind on your face as you hung the washing. You turned those things into meaning. You built altars out of crumbs. You survived the way wildflowers do, unwanted, unnoticed, but still growing. And on days when everything felt too heavy, when your body ached, when your husband was cruel, when your heart felt like an echo, you remembered that you were not alone. That generations of women had stood in that same place, had whispered the same prayers, had counted the same stars through tears they dared not shed in daylight. You remembered that they had survived too, that they had planted seeds in silence, that they had passed down their strength through hands and glances and lullabies. You remembered your mother's stories, not the ones she told with words, but the ones she told with the way she carried herself, the way she kept going, the way she held you close when no one else did. You remembered her warning, spoken once and never repeated. Don't let them take everything. And you held on to that, even when it felt like they already had, even when it felt like there was nothing left, because there was always something, a thought, a breath, a refusal, a truth too quiet to kill, that you were not made for this cage, that love should not hurt, that obedience was not virtue, that you deserved more. You whispered those truths in the dark. You carved them into the inside of your ribs. You buried them beneath your pillow. You sewed them into your daughter's blanket. And you waited, not for rescue, but for a world that might listen, a world that might believe you, a world that might remember the names of the women who came before, not as property, not as burdens, not as background to someone else's story, but as voices, as lives, as flames that never fully went out. And tonight, one of those flames speaks through you. Because you are still here, because you endured, because you were more than a bride. You were a person, and that still matters. They said it was your duty to uphold the household, but the house you held was made of expectations, and they cracked beneath your feet. Not wood, not stone, but duty layered on duty, each heavier than the last. You were told to honor your husband, to honor the church, to honor your father and the land he gave you away with, but no one asked you to honor yourself. That was not a concern. That was not even a concept. You rose before the bells rang, with the frost still clinging to the windows and the cold pressing its fingers against your throat. You washed in water that stung. You dressed in silence. You checked the hearth, the baby, the goat, the bread, all before you spoke a single word. And sometimes you didn't speak at all. Hours could pass, entire days, where the only sounds you made were the creak of your knees on the floor, the scrape of your knife on stale root vegetables, the breath you took before a door opened. You were called Lady of the House. But the house was not yours. It was his walls, his food, his rules, his right to discipline. And discipline he did not always with fists, sometimes with silence, sometimes with shame, with the way he praised another woman's soup, with the way he looked at your body like it was less than it used to be, with the way he reminded you of your place without ever raising his voice. Those were the sharpest punishments, the ones that left no marks but never healed. You were told that your love should be unconditional, but his came with terms, conditions, expectations you could never meet. Be beautiful, be fertile, be quiet, be grateful. Be gone if you fail, and still you tried. Not because you believed you could please him, but because there was no other choice. You were stitched into the fabric of his life like thread pulled too tight, and when it broke, you were blamed for fraying. He left for days sometimes. For the fields, for the market, for war, and you stayed. You kept the children alive. You held the house together, you kissed wounds, you buried chickens, you whispered prayers over herbs you barely believed in. And when he returned, you smiled, even when you wanted to scream, because screaming was useless. Screaming was dangerous. Screaming made you the problem. You watched the seasons shift from behind the same window. You counted the springs by how many babies you'd buried. You marked your life in deaths of people, of animals, of parts of yourself, and yet they still told you marriage was a gift, that to be chosen was to be blessed, that to wear the ring was to wear the favor of God. But the ring felt like a shackle, and sometimes you twisted it on your finger just to feel something you could control. There were days when you forgot the sound of your own laughter, when you walked past the looking glass and did not recognize the eyes staring back, when the dreams you used to have of travel, of books, of softness felt like someone else's memories. You caught yourself staring at the fire too long, not thinking, just letting the heat remind you that feeling wasn't always pain. You heard the neighbor woman scream once, late at night, a sound torn from the throat, like something wild. No one came. No one spoke of it the next day. Her eye was swollen for a week. Her husband brought a larger ox to market. People said she was lucky, and you believed them, because that was the bar. Not happiness, not freedom, just survival, and even that, barely. You learned the codes. How to signal pain without saying it. How to nod with your chin but never your eyes. How to squeeze a sister's hand in church without anyone noticing. You learned which midwives kept secrets, which traders wouldn't talk if you bought herbs twice in 1 week. You learned to save crusts, to bury bruises, to keep the door barred if the men were drinking. You learned that dignity was not something given. It was something protected, hidden, guarded, and sometimes sacrificed. You tried to raise your daughter differently, to teach her the things no one taught you, to praise her thoughts, to listen when she spoke. But the world was louder. The world told her to be obedient, to be pretty, to be pleasing, and you watched her shrink the way you once did. And you hated yourself for not being able to stop it. You hated the church bells that told her to kneel. You hated the women who smiled at her new breasts. You hated the silence that surrounded her fear. And you hated that you knew, before she did, exactly how her story would go. Because it was your story. It was your mother's. It was every woman's. You traced it in your dreams. You tasted it in your tea. You saw it in the hands that held her dowry, a name written beside a man's. And suddenly, she would no longer be your daughter. She would be someone's wife. And so the cycle continued. Sometimes you imagined walking into the forest and never returning, taking only bread, a blanket, your name, living in a hut where no one found you, speaking only to birds and the trees. But you never did, because fantasy was a luxury, because there was laundry, because the baby cried, because your husband might come home early, because the church taught you that wanting anything else was sin. But you still thought of it, and in that thought, in that moment of treason against the cage, you felt the only real freedom you had left. You closed your eyes and whispered, not for salvation, not for help, but for remembering that you once had a voice, that you once had a life before the veil, that the bride you became was not the end of you, just a chapter, just a name on a page you could one day reclaim. They never called it captivity, not to your face, not in the sermons, not in the lullabies. They called it commitment. They called it honor. They said a bride was the heart of the home, the spine of the family, the guardian of virtue. But when the doors were locked and the candles burned low, when the bruises formed under chemises and the whispers traveled from hearth to hearth, you knew the truth. They called it a role. You lived it as a sentence, not one carved by a judge, but by a culture, by an agreement no one asked you to sign. From the first moment you were taught to curtsy, to cross your ankles when sitting, to lower your gaze when men walked by, your body began to disappear. You were praised for disappearing. You were told that silence was strength, that endurance was godliness, that pain was purity. And when your wedding came, it was not a celebration of who you were, but of who you would cease to be. You learned to smile when your name was replaced by his. You learned to hold your tongue when your thoughts were laughed at. You learned to lie with grace, to say, I'm fine when you were unraveling, to say, of course, when your stomach turned, to say amen when your prayers went unanswered. They told you to be grateful, to be chosen, as though being chosen was a reward, as though being claimed was a blessing, as though being wanted was the same as being loved. You saw other brides, their faces pale behind lace, their fingers trembling as they held flowers they did not pick. And you saw what came after. The slow dimming, the quiet retreats, the sudden flinches, the way they said less each year, the way their laughter turned into habits. You saw the same story written again and again, in kitchens and corners and candlelit confessions. And yet you were told to celebrate, to honor the day you were given away, like a fruit at market, like a debt repaid. And you did, because to not celebrate was to betray your family, to dishonor your husband, to raise suspicion. And suspicion was dangerous. A woman with too many opinions was called unruly. A woman with too few children was called barren. A woman with bruises was called careless. A woman without bruises was called lucky. But no woman was called free. Not truly. Even the queens had their cages. Even the abbesses were watched. You learned to survive by shrinking, by shaping yourself to the room, by predicting moods like weather. You became a storm reader, a softness in chaos. You smiled through teeth that ached. You kissed hands that struck. You stood beside men who spoke over you and nodded like their words were yours. And when you cried, you did it in small ways, into basins, into bread dough, into sleeves. You became fluent in quiet grief. And yet, you did not break. You adapted. You bent. You softened without dissolving. You endured. And in the quiet, you created beauty. In gardens, in lullabies, in embroidery that told stories no one else could see, in glances passed between women like codes, in the way you folded linens, in the way you remembered the names of herbs that healed better than any prayer. You left behind traces, not loud, not permanent, but undeniable. You began to see yourself in the past, not just as a victim of it, but as a witness, as proof that a woman could live within the cage and still carry fire, that a bride could be silenced but not erased. You remembered the girl you were, the one who ran in bare feet, who whispered to birds, who traced stars and wished without shame. And slowly, you made space for her again. Not publicly, not foolishly, but in secret. You let her dream while stirring stew. You let her sing when no one was home. You let her speak inside your mind when others called you simple. You did not correct them. You had nothing to prove. Your truth lived deeper than their words could reach. You saw the world for what it was, a stage where women bled in silence while the audience applauded the performance. You stopped expecting applause. You started seeking peace, a quiet kind, a true kind, the kind that came when a child laughed and didn't flinch, when a neighbor winked instead of questioned, when the wind blew through an open window and no one told you to shut it. You began to build your life not around them, but around the small pockets they forgot to guard. That was your revolution, not rebellion, not escape, but reclamation of minutes, of ETH, of meaning. You stopped waiting to be rescued. You realized no one was coming. Not the knights, not the saints, not the gods. You became the one who stayed, who watched, who remembered. You wrote your history in the margins, and even if the world never read it, you did. And so it lived, and so did you. They never wrote down your story, not fully, not with honesty. In the old manuscripts, they remembered the names of kings and knights, the titles of bishops, the victories of men who bled on battlefields. But they did not remember the women who bled in beds, who gave birth in barns, who were traded like sheep and dressed like saints and buried in nameless graves. They did not carve your likeness into stone unless you were beside a husband. They did not paint your face unless it wore a crown. They did not sing of your courage unless you died for someone else's glory. But you were there, every day, from sunrise to moonrise, threading needles, kneading bread, whispering prayers you didn't fully believe in because to stop praying felt dangerous. You were there when sons went to war. You were there when plagues came through the door. You were there when the grain failed, when the milk soured, when the candle burned low and the voices grew loud. You were there, and they forgot you. But forgetting is not the same as erasing, and silence is not the same as absence. You lived in the margins of the world, and in the margins, you wrote yourself, not with ink, with endurance, with breath, with eyes that saw everything, and mouths that spoke only when the doors were shut. You survived not by wielding power, but by navigating it, dodging it, softening it, turning it back on itself when you could. You were clever in ways no one praised. You were strong in ways no one named. And when they called you blessed for marrying well, for birthing often, for dying quietly, you smiled like a woman who knew the weight of every word. They taught you that heaven waited for the obedient. That paradise was for the pure. But you learned that purity was a knife, and obedience was a noose. And both were worn like garlands until they strangled. You tried to find meaning in faith, but faith was often used against you. They read scripture over your pain. They quoted verses while you wept. They told you your suffering was sacred, as if holiness came in bruises. And maybe, for a time, you believed them. Because belief was all you had. Because belief was easier than despair. But even belief grew tired, especially when it never brought comfort. Especially when the man who beat you knelt at mass with clean hands and a quiet smile. Especially when the priest looked at you like forgiveness was not yours to claim. And still you stayed. Not because you were weak, but because the world had left no doors open. Because running was death. Because silence was survival. Because there were children. Or ailing parents. Or a winter that would kill you faster than a husband's temper. They called it sacrifice. But it was strategy. They called it surrender. But it was structure. You built yourself like a fortress, not made of stone, but of habit, of calculation, of tiny victories no one else saw. You placed your rebellion where they'd never look, in the way you salted the stew just how you liked it, in the way you taught your daughter to read, even when books were forbidden, in the way you kept a coin tucked into your shoe, just in case. You weren't waiting for freedom, you were preparing for it. Quietly, patiently. And when it didn't come, you passed the hope to someone else. In stories, in warnings, in the way you held your granddaughter's face and said, "Be careful with men who smile too much." In the way you taught her the herbs that ease pain, the plants that end pregnancies, the names of women who never married and still lived. You fed her more than bread. You fed her fire. You gave her a map through the shadows you never escaped. And maybe she found her way out. Maybe she stood in a world you never saw. Maybe she told your story. Maybe that story found ears. And maybe, just maybe, that's why your voice echoes here tonight. Through centuries. Through silence. Through the bones of forgotten brides. You were not just a wife, not just a vessel, not just a name in a church ledger. You were a person with desires, with rage, with memory. You were alive in a time that didn't want you to be. And you stayed alive anyway. And if that doesn't matter to them, it matters here. It matters now. It matters in the way the wind still moves through the grass the same way it did when you once stood barefoot behind the barn. It matters in the way someone, somewhere, still hums the tune you used to hum while spinning wool. It matters in the rhythm of the stories women still tell each other in kitchens, in stairwells, in bathrooms, in whispers. You were never erased, only hidden. And now, piece by piece, breath by breath, you are returning. Your story was not a tragedy, it was a testimony. And though they tried to bind it with marriage, with modesty, with shame, it survived. You survived, and this voice, tonight, is proof. That even the quietest girl in the smallest village, sold young and buried early, can still speak, can still be heard, can still change everything. They said a wedding was the most beautiful day of a woman's life. They said it with smiles, with songs, with ribbons in their hands and prayers on their lips. But you knew better. You saw the looks exchanged behind veils, the trembling hands, the way the older women stood nearby, holding their breath, pretending they had forgotten what came next. They told you to walk slowly, to smile, to be graceful. And so you did, as if you were not walking into something permanent. As if your own body wasn't about to become someone else's property. The dress was never yours. The food was not for you. The songs weren't sung to celebrate you. They were sung to mark your surrender, to welcome you into the arms of a man who had not earned your trust but had purchased your presence. You stood before an altar not to be united but to be transferred, from father to husband, from girl to wife, from person to possession, and no one asked you if that was what you wanted, because wanting wasn't yours to do. Desire was dangerous, preference was prideful, to hesitate was a sin, and so you nodded. You took the vows. You drank the wine. You kissed the lips of a stranger. You were applauded for it. You were blessed for it. But you were not free. That night, when the doors shut and the candles flickered low, when the laces of your gown were undone by unfamiliar hands, when the bed creaked and the prayers turned to panting, you learned what the wedding truly meant. Not love, not unity, but access. It meant someone else decided when your body was touched, when your womb would fill, when your name would be called and how it would be remembered. The morning after, your body ached in places you hadn't known could hurt, and still they smiled. They asked if you were happy. They asked if it was special. And when you could not answer, they assumed the silence was joy. They didn't know you had wept. They didn't want to, because to know would mean admitting the cruelty baked into the ritual. So they told stories instead, of romance, of destiny, of how lucky you were to be chosen, as if being chosen erased what had been taken, as if a ring on your finger replaced the voice in your throat. They spoke of the future now, children, duties, decorum. They began calling you wife more than they used your name. And slowly, that name faded. You faded. You became what they expected. Smiling, soft-spoken, serviceable. They praised you for your obedience, not your opinion. They measured your worth in milk and manners, and in the spaces where your thoughts once lived, you built cages of caution. You forgot how to speak without asking permission. You forgot how to walk without counting your steps. You forgot that you had ever wanted anything that wasn't allowed. But deep inside, there remained a flicker, a memory, of a time before vows, before rules. Before the weight of duty bent your back and silenced your breath, you remembered laughter, loud and unashamed. You remembered dancing barefoot in mud. You remembered dreams that had no names, only feelings. And you began to wonder, was that girl gone? Or was she just waiting? And if she waited, was there still a way back? That question became a companion, a secret companion. You carried it through each day, through each mended shirt, each swept floor, each obedient nod. You held it close when the doors were locked and the shadows came. You whispered it in the quietest hours. You said it with your eyes when your mouth could not. It was not rebellion, not yet, but it was something, a beginning. And sometimes, in the dark, when your husband slept and the wind rattled the shutters, you imagined another life. One where you had not been given away. One where your name still belonged to you. One where you chose who touched you, who heard you, who held you. It was a dangerous thought, but it was yours. And in a world where so little belonged to you, that was everything. You learned to count in silence, not with numbers, but with instincts. You counted the footsteps in the hallway when his temper burned. You counted the days between his rages. You counted how many times you could ask for something before it was called nagging. How many glances were too bold. How many bites you were allowed to take at the table before someone said you'd grown greedy. You counted your words, your sighs, your tears. And in that arithmetic of survival, you lost pieces of yourself, not all at once. But like hair falling from a comb strand by strand, your life was a discipline. You were praised for how little space you took, how soft your voice was, how still you stood. And each compliment stung like a lash, because they were not admiration, they were confirmation that your erasure was complete, that you had done what was expected, that you had disappeared in the correct manner. They said you were good, and you hated that goodness. Because it meant you had obeyed every rule that diminished you. It meant you had survived by submission. They never saw the moments you slipped outside when no one was watching. The way you let the wind lift your sleeves and remind you that your skin still belonged to the sky. The way you pressed your palms into the dirt and let it hold you, as if the earth itself remembered who you were before they called you his. In the forest, you weren't a wife. In the field, you weren't a title. You were a creature, a breath, a pulse. And in those brief, stolen seconds, you remembered that life was not meant to be endured. It was meant to be lived. But the memory faded quickly. It had to. Because the bread would burn. Because the child would cry. Because the man would return. And so you swallowed the wind. You brushed off the dirt. You put the smile back on your face like a shield. You returned to the rhythm, and no one noticed the rebellion hiding in your ribcage. They called it dignity. They called it grace. But it was endurance. And it was not gentle. It was fierce. It was the scream you held in your lungs every time he touched you without tenderness. It was the curse you didn't speak when your body tore in childbirth, and they called it a blessing. It was the storm inside you that never passed because it was never allowed to rain. And in that storm, you built a self. Not the one they saw, but the one you remembered. The one who asked questions, who laughed with her mouth open, who danced without permission. You spoke to her in dreams. You sang to her in whispers while you scrubbed floors, and you swore you would not forget her, even if the world tried to, even if the prayers said she was sinful, even if the priest said she was shameful. You wrapped her in silence and carried her like a relic, sacred, hidden, yours, and she gave you strength to keep breathing, to keep waking, to keep pretending. And then, sometimes she gave you more. She gave you the urge to say no, quietly, then louder, then with your full chest. And though that no was dangerous, though it trembled in your throat like a bird in a cage, it was real, it was yours. It was the beginning of something no one else could see, a crack in the wall, a candle in the dark. And when you said it, even just once, the world did not end, and that terrified them. Because if you could say no, then others could. And if others could, then the whole fragile order might collapse. So they tried to silence you, again, with shame, with scripture, with threats. But you had tasted your own voice, and it did not taste like sin. It tasted like truth. And once truth lives in the mouth, it's hard to swallow lies again. So you held on to it, even when it hurt, even when it cost you, even when they called you mad, because madness was better than obedience. Because madness meant you still knew who you were. And when the day came that your daughter asked you why the world was so cruel, you didn't lie. You didn't tell her it was God's will. You didn't tell her to stay silent. You told her the truth, that this world was built by men who feared women who remembered their power, that everything holy had been twisted into a leash, that love was not what they taught. Love was not blind submission. Love was not silent suffering. Love was freedom, choice, respect. And if that meant your name was forgotten, if it meant you were called bitter or wild or ungrateful, then so be it. Because your daughter would know, and her daughter would know, and somewhere, someday, a girl would stand at an altar and walk away. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. Because she had your voice in her blood, and your story in her bones. And that story, once buried, would bloom again, like wildflowers in ruins, bright, unstoppable, beautiful. They told you marriage was your purpose. They told you it was sacred, that it was your highest achievement, your divine reward, your final destination. But they never told you what came after the songs stopped, after the wine dried on the stone floors, after the guests went home and the garlands withered, after your name was spoken in the past tense, as if your girlhood had died at the altar. They never told you about the weight of the keys they placed in your hand, not as power, but as responsibility. To the pantry, to the cellar, to the nursery, to the rooms you'd clean, the mouths you'd feed, the silence you'd swallow. They never told you that the very house they said you'd rule would become your cage. The windows too high, the doors too heavy, the halls too long and cold. They never told you that your body would be judged not by your health, your strength, your joy, but by its usefulness. By how quietly it bled each month, by how quickly it conceived, by how many sons it bore. And if it failed, if the womb stayed empty, or the babies died, they would not mourn with you. They would blame you. They would whisper about curses and sins. They would ask what you had done to offend God. They would watch you like a broken thing, like a vessel cracked before its time, and still expect you to smile, to serve, to be grateful. They never told you how lonely it would be, even surrounded by people, surrounded by noise, surrounded by demands. They never told you how a woman could disappear inside her own skin, how her name could be spoken every day but never meant, how her hands could be raw from work, her heart hollow from giving, and no one would notice, because that was what a good wife did. She gave without being asked. She obeyed without being thanked. She sacrificed without being seen. And when she cried, she did it quietly, into bread dough or behind a closed door, so the children wouldn't hear. They never told you that the pain in your hips wouldn't just be from childbirth, but from being bent into a role you never chose. That the ache in your chest wouldn't just be sorrow, but rage. Silent, contained, inherited. They never told you that you would look at your reflection one day and not recognize the eyes staring back. That you would search for the girl you were and find only shadows. A smile practiced too long. A posture trained into stillness. A mouth that had forgotten how to speak anything but consent. They never told you that love, if it came at all, would come in stolen glances and guarded silences. Not from the man who shared your bed, but from moments. A kindness from a sister-in-law. A story whispered by a wet nurse. A song remembered from childhood. A breeze that reminded you of who you were before they named you wife. They never told you that your worth would be written in dowries and debts, in the bruises you hid and the dinners you prepared. That your story would be edited by others. That your truth would be considered inconvenient. That your silence would be praised more than your voice. And they never told you how easily history would forget you. How the records would list your name only next to a husband's. How your life would be measured in relation to a man. Never in its own right, never as its own flame, never as its own legacy. But some nights, when the fire burned low and no one called your name, you remembered. Not everything, just flashes. A time before you were tamed. A time before you were assigned. When your thoughts were your own. When your skin didn't flinch at touch. When you woke with dreams instead of dread. And in those moments, you didn't mourn what you had lost. You lit it like a lantern inside you. You carried it through the dark. You passed it to your daughter, not in words, but in glances. In the way you let her run barefoot. In the way you didn't scold her for speaking loudly. In the way you told her stories of women with swords and voices and wings. And even if they called those stories dangerous, even if they called them lies, you told them anyway, because they were truths wrapped in fiction, because they were your truth, repainted with hope. And when you were old, when your hands trembled and your hair silvered, you looked back not with pride but with knowing. You knew the world had taken much from you, too much. But it had not taken everything. It had not taken your will. It had not taken your memory. It had not taken the part of you that refused to die, even when starved. And in that quiet defiance, you found peace. Not the peace they promised you, not the peace of submission, but the peace of survival, the peace of persistence, the peace of having carried the truth through a world that did not want it spoken. And when you closed your eyes for the last time, it was not with regret. It was with the knowledge that somewhere your story would be heard. Maybe not by scribes, maybe not in books, but in whispers, in songs, in daughters who looked at their mothers and saw more than obedience, who saw strength, fire, a name that had never truly been lost, only buried, and now finally beginning to bloom. They told you marriage would protect you from poverty, from shame, from loneliness, but the truth was different. Marriage protected no one but the institution itself. It was not a sanctuary. It was a system, a transaction disguised as tradition, a prison lined with embroidered linens and gilded promises. They told you the veil was a symbol of purity, but it was also a blindfold, a warning, as soft surrender. They draped it over your face and expected you to walk forward without question, to step into a life chosen for you, to bind your name and body and breath to a man whose hands you may not have known, whose voice might have only echoed across a cold stone hall on the day of betrothal. They told you obedience would bring peace, that to serve was to be cherished. But they never told you that peace could mean silence, that being cherished could mean being owned, that love, in this world, was often just another word for control. The vows were clear, to honor and obey. There was no mention of joy, no space for dissent. Your consent was assumed, not asked. And so, when the doors closed behind you on that first night, and the walls listened closer than you ever could, you did what was expected. You laid still. You endured. You prayed, not for passion or connection, but for it to be over quickly, for him to be kind, for the bed not to bleed too much, for the morning to come. And when it did, you rose with the sun and smiled, because to frown would raise questions, and questions brought judgment, and judgment brought shame. They told you bearing children would fulfill you, that a womb was a holy vessel. But no one said what would happen when the holy turned hollow, when the pain didn't leave after the child was born, when your body tore in places that didn't heal, when the baby didn't cry, or stopped crying, or cried too much and never stopped. No one told you what it was like to feel your own soul leave you slowly, drop by drop, each time a little one was buried in the cold earth and the village whispered about punishment, about sin, about women who were cursed. And through it all, you had to keep moving, milking, baking, praying, pretending. You were never allowed to stop, to scream, to rest. They told you that your role was noble, that your suffering was virtuous. But virtue didn't hold your hand at night. Virtue didn't stop the beatings. Virtue didn't protect your daughters from the same fate. It only made your pain invisible. It only sanctified your silence. And so you learned to live within it. You became an expert in enduring. You knew how to fold grief into bread, how to stitch fear into lace, how to turn rage into prayer, and no one noticed. They praised you for your strength. But it wasn't strength. It was survival. It was adaptation. It was the only way not to break. But you still broke, quietly, privately, in moments too small to be seen, in the way your hands shook when the church bells rang, in the way you flinched when he spoke your name, in the way you forgot your own laughter. And when you reached out for help, for hope, for healing, there was only the echo of duty, the crushing weight of this is just the way it is. And in time, you stopped reaching. You closed the door. You sewed the wound shut. You taught your daughters to do the same. And the cycle continued. Not because you were weak, but because the world made it near impossible to be anything else. But even then, in the deepest quiet, you remembered. Not with words, but with ache, with dreams, with flickers of a life that might have been yours if you had been born elsewhere, elsewhen. A life where your body was yours, where your voice was heard, where marriage was a choice, not a sentence. And that dream stayed with you. You passed it down in lullabies and stories. You whispered it to your children as they fell asleep. A better world, a kinder one they might live to see. And maybe they would. Maybe they'd learn not just to survive, but to thrive. Maybe they'd look back at your life not with pity, but with reverence, with understanding, with fire. And they'd say, she didn't get to choose, but we will. And maybe that would be enough. Maybe that would be everything. They said your wedding day was the happiest day of your life, that the flowers were blessings, that the bells were promises, that the feast was a reward for purity, patience, propriety. But they never said what it cost to get there. They never spoke of the months, sometimes years of arrangements, negotiations, inspections, rejections, doubts, fears. They never told you about the way men sat at heavy tables and discussed your future like wheat prices or pasture access, comparing you to other girls like horses in a market, noting your dowry, your hips, your obedience, your silence. They never told you that when your mother brushed your hair the night before, her hands trembled not from joy but from grief. Because she knew. She remembered. She saw herself in you, and she couldn't protect you, only prepare you. And even that, barely. The day itself was not yours. It belonged to the guests, the families, the transaction. Your smile was rehearsed. Your dress was stitched by hands you barely knew. You were paraded before the village not as a woman but as a symbol, a bridge between lands, between men, between ambitions. And then came the moment they called sacred, holy, final. When the priest read words you didn't write, when the man beside you held your hand not with affection but with expectation, and you said yes. Not because you wanted to, because you had to, because the silence around you had taught you there was no other answer. And so you were wed. And everything changed. And nothing changed. Because you were still yourself, confused, frightened, curious, yearning, but now you were not allowed to be. Now you were wife. And that word came with weight, with ritual, with shadow. They told you to tend the hearth, to honor your husband, to manage the servants if you had any, to rise early and sleep late, to keep accounts, to supervise the milking, the baking, the spinning, and above all to bear heirs. And if your body failed, the blame fell only on you. You could be cast aside, replaced, shamed. And no one would call it cruelty. They would call it necessity. They would say it was God's will. They would say it was your duty. Even if your belly had swelled and emptied 6 times with no cradle filled. Even if the pain left you unable to walk. Even if the blood didn't stop for days. Even if your mind slipped, piece by piece, into the dark, you were expected to smile, to kneel in church, to bless your misfortune as a lesson. And when your husband strayed or beat you or ignored you, you were expected to understand, to forgive, to try harder, because you were wife. And wife meant endurance. Wife meant silence. Wife meant never making others uncomfortable with your pain. The house became a stage. You learned where to stand. How to speak, what to hide. You dressed your wounds in lace and prayer. You covered bruises with veils and holy water. You hosted meals even when you hadn't eaten in days. You rocked babies even when your arms felt broken. And in the quietest hours, when the world slept and no one demanded anything of you, you sometimes let yourself remember just a moment, a field, a song, a stolen hour with your sister, long gone. The way your feet felt in the river as a child, the way you once laughed without fear, and you held those fragments like relics, precious, hidden, because they reminded you that you had existed before the vows, before the role, before the cage, and still existed somewhere inside it. But that didn't make it easier. The days were long, the winters colder, the questions louder, and the older you grew, the more you realized how little of your life was truly yours. Your body, spoken for. Your words, dismissed. Your thoughts, judged. And your heart, that still beat with longing, was treated as something childish, shameful, dangerous. You learned to fold it small, to tuck it away, to speak kindly to others and cruelly to yourself, to doubt every impulse that didn't match the script. And they praised you for it. They said you were pious, gentle, mature, but you weren't. You were withering, quietly, slowly, elegantly, and no one noticed. Not even you, until it was too late to change, and still, the world around you kept spinning. Seasons shifted, children grew, husbands aged, but the expectations remained the same. You were no longer a bride, no longer fresh with blush and lace, but the chains didn't rust. They gleamed in new forms: respectability, matronhood, dignity. You were now expected to teach others how to submit, how to fold dreams into duty, how to offer silence in exchange for survival. Young girls came to you with questions in their eyes, and you smiled, but your smile was a wound stitched shut. You told them what you had been told, that love would come, that obedience was strength, that sacrifice was noble. And yet a part of you screamed with every word, because you knew what followed the wedding songs. You knew the Ache of longing turned stale, of freedom bartered for linen and land. You knew how the body hardened over time, not with muscle but with fear. You knew how trust could be pried loose, piece by piece, until you no longer believed your own voice. The church spoke often of virtue, of the sanctity of marriage, but behind its stone walls, confessions told a different story. Women whispering of bruises, of nights filled with dread, of hunger that wasn't just of the belly, but of the soul. And the priest would nod, offer penance, tell you to pray harder, love deeper, forgive more. But what if forgiveness was the rope? What if love had turned into a leash? What if your prayers went unanswered because heaven had been taught to listen only to men? You dared not ask. Because questions were dangerous, they marked you. And marked women were easy to silence, easy to blame, easy to bury, so you held your tongue. You moved through halls like a ghost, tending fires that never warmed you, cooking meals for mouths that rarely thanked you. And all the while, you faded. Not dramatically, not with a scream, but with a whisper, a breath, 1,000 little denials of self. You told yourself it was worth it for the children, for the family, for peace. And maybe it was. Maybe it was the only choice in a world with no doors. But even then, your bones remembered. In the ache of your knees, in the bend of your back, in the way your hands trembled when no one watched. You were not made for this. No one was. And yet it continued, year after year, generation after generation, until silence became inheritance, until endurance became identity, until suffering was worn like a crown, and outside, the world praised you. They called you resilient, devout, honorable, but they didn't see the price. They didn't see the nights you spent alone in a bed too large, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was what God wanted, if this was all you would ever be. They didn't see the moments you caught your reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back, a stranger dressed in respectability, whose eyes had seen too much, whose voice had been buried under layers of ritual and role. You had become a symbol, and symbols don't get to feel, they get to endure. And you did, with grace, with shame, with strength you never asked to carry. And perhaps the cruelest part was that no one ever said thank you. No one acknowledged the cost. They only expected more labor, more sacrifice, more silence. You were a well that never ran dry until you did. And when you finally broke, when your mind unraveled or your body collapsed, they called it mystery. They called it fate. But it wasn't. It was centuries of weight, all balanced on the back of a girl who was once told her wedding day would be the beginning of her happiness. It was not the beginning. It was the exchange, the signing over of self, the quiet farewell to possibility. But somewhere deep beneath the layers of linen and duty and time, you still pulsed, still breathed, still hoped. And perhaps that, more than anything, was the rebellion, the quiet, enduring fire that refused to go out, even when everything else turned to ash. You may think the cruelty ended with marriage, that once the feast was over and the vows were spoken, a woman's fate simply settled into quiet submission, but in truth, the real suffering had only just begun. For now came the rituals of confirmation, of proof, of legitimacy. And one of the most brutal, humiliating, yet widely accepted customs across many parts of medieval Europe was the public bedding ceremony. Imagine this: the wedding guests, still drunk on wine and power, shouting ribald songs outside your chamber. The priest who had just blessed your union standing nearby, pretending not to hear. And you, barely 17, maybe younger, led into a room not of comfort but of witness. You were expected to lie with your new husband, a man often twice your age, in the presence of attendants, sometimes even family, who watched for signs that the marriage had been consummated. Sheets were inspected for blood. Midwives lingered to ensure the act had taken place. This was not privacy. This was performance. This was you being reduced to evidence. And if there was no blood, no visible proof, you were suspect. Your virtue questioned. Your reputation trembling on the brink of collapse. Because the myth of virginity bled into law and custom. The female body was expected to break, to bleed, to scream, and if it didn't, you were a liar, a fraud, a threat. Some brides, terrified of this ordeal, wounded themselves beforehand using thorns or sharp stones to produce the red stain that would quiet suspicion. Others drank concoctions to numb their bodies, to survive the pain of being forced, not just by their husband, but by the whole structure around them. Because in truth, what occurred that night was rarely an act of love. It was a legal requirement, a proof of purchase, a duty, and in many regions, failure to meet expectations after marriage often led to rejection. Women could be returned to their family in shame, with no chance for a new beginning. It didn't matter why. It didn't matter how painful it was. Men were rarely judged. If a man struggled, it was excused. A matter of health, a passing issue. But if a woman hesitated or resisted, it was seen as rebellion, disobedience, wrongdoing. Some were forced to obey. Others kept in isolation until they gave in. And those who ran were brought back and punished because they were not seen as people. They were part of a contract, a body offered as a promise. And still, words like purity and honor were spoken. Poets praised love, yet love without choice is not love. Behind closed doors, there was no poetry. Still, brides were told to smile, to be thankful, to fulfill their role, even when hurt, even when silenced, even when overwhelmed. Then came the routine, a life shaped by expectations. To bring joy, to raise children, to keep order, to always say yes, to never say no. If she failed, others stepped in. And still, blame followed her. She wasn't graceful enough, not warm enough, not quick to please. She didn't cook well, didn't have sons, didn't keep the space clean. And then came punishment. Some were shut away, some were hurt, some were stripped of their dignity. And if the husband had status, she had no safety. Rules defended him, customs praised him, and she remained quiet. Time passed, she adjusted, she learned to watch, to listen, to keep herself still, to expect the nights when peace turned to tension, and she said nothing, because no one listened. Her mother had warned her gently, but never fully, and the others nearby lived the same pattern. To speak truth was dangerous, so she held on to the image of joy, of pride, of family, even if it was false. Because if not this, what remained? Routine wrapped in cloth, control disguised as care, structure protected by silence. Deep inside, something changed. Not bravery, not calm, just a quiet awareness that her story was shared by many, passed from one to the next, whispered, carried, remembered. And time did not end it. She had children, as expected. Each birth brought risk. Some were calm, some were painful, some ended in loss. Still, she was asked to try again, because value was measured in legacy, in sons, in the future. She was praised when all went well, blamed when it didn't. A loss meant guilt. A complication meant fault. If she mourned, she was told to be strong, to keep going. Her grief wasn't noticed. Her cries weren't heard. They were assumed. And when her role was done, when her body could no longer give, she wasn't free. She became quiet, less visible, less central. Others stepped into her place. And she remained forgotten, spoken of only in past tense. Not for who she was, but for what she had done. And with that came another silence. Not the silence of duty, but of absence, a slow ending. Yet she was told to guide the next, to prepare them, to say it was right. And if she didn't, she was blamed again. Too harsh, too bitter, not supportive. But how could she not speak when her daughter, still young, was promised to an older man? When the fear in her eyes was clear, she lied again, because truth was not allowed. And sometimes, because it hurt too much to say, noun, that you had lived it, that you had done nothing to change it, that perhaps you even enforced it. The legacy of brides was not just endurance, it was complicity, passed down like a cursed dowry. And so the cycle turned. The rings changed hands. The veils were lifted, the hymns repeated, And another girl became a woman, became a wife, became a ghost. It did not matter if she was noble or peasant, rich or poor. There were differences. Yes, fewer beatings, perhaps, more silk, but the core remained the same. A transaction, a silencing, a sacrifice. And what of those who resisted? Who said no? Who refused? They were legends, or warnings. Joan of Arc burned, witches drowned, widows feared, virgins mocked. There was no path for a woman that did not require pain. Even the convents, those supposed refuges, were filled with rules, with submission, with cold. And those who fled were hunted, and those who survived became stories, tales whispered in kitchens, songs sung in secret. And sometimes you wondered, was it always this way? Did ancient women suffer too? Did goddesses bleed into housewives? Did queens become shadows? And if so, when did it begin? Who decided? Who wrote the rules? Who held the pen? The truth was, no one remembered. The world had been built on these foundations for so long. No one questioned the stone. But you did. Quietly, at night, in bed, listening to your husband's breath, holding your own. You questioned everything. The hymns, the books, the looks. And in those questions, something stirred. Not rebellion, not fire, just knowing. A deep, aching knowing that this life was not what you were made for, that there had to be something more. But the world offered no maps, no keys, no exits, only doors that led back to the same room. And you learned to decorate the room, to make it bearable, to plant flowers, to light candles, to laugh with other women who were decorating their rooms too. And in that shared silence, in that mutual recognition, you found fragments of solace. Not freedom, not justice, but connection. Because even if the world erased you, it had not succeeded in erasing your mind, or your memory, or your truth. You held onto it carefully, like a coal in your palm, letting it warm you, burn you, remind you. And one day, long after your husband's voice had gone hoarse, long after your children had left, long after your name had been reduced to grandmother or old wife, you wrote it down, or you told someone, a niece, a neighbor, a stranger at the well. You told them your truth, and though they didn't believe you, not at first, the words settled, they lingered, they planted roots, and so the curse began to crack. Not break, not yet, but crack. Because silence, once broken, cannot be repaired. And even if the world didn't change in your lifetime, even if no statues were raised, no books were written, no laws were passed, you had done something. You had remembered. And remembering was rebellion. In a world built to forget. By the end of your life, you had become many things, none of which you had chosen. You had been the maiden, the bride, the mother, the matron, the widow, but never just you. The girl who once dreamed by the riverbank. The child who asked questions about the stars. The young woman who paused too long at the market imagining escape. All of her had been buried beneath layers of duty, of identity forced upon you, of roles sewn into your skin like a second layer of flesh. You were not allowed to remain whole. You were fragmented, parceled out to others. A piece for your father, a piece for your husband, a piece for the church, a piece for the children. And when there was nothing left, they called you wise, or weary, or irrelevant, and you were expected to pass it on, to repeat the pattern, to stitch the same wound into the bodies of the next generation. But perhaps, with time, with distance, with the weight of memory heavy on your shoulders, you began to see the shape of the lie, the grandeur of the deception, that the suffering was not holy, that obedience was not virtue, that survival was not the same as living. And in this realization, there was grief, immense, suffocating, because no one had warned you, or rather they had warned you in riddles, in songs, in proverbs. A good wife is silent, a patient woman lives long, a happy home needs no complaints. These were not guidance, they were chains, spoken in sweet tones, wrapped in love. But chains all the same. And so one night, In the stillness of your room, you wrote a letter. Not to anyone, not to be sent, just to exist, to break the silence. It began with your name, the one you had not heard in decades. Not wife of, not mother to, just your name. And then the truth poured out. In jagged lines, in trembling ink, you wrote of the wedding that felt like a funeral, of the night that took something from you and never gave it back, of the mornings you bled and were told to smile, of the nights you prayed not for salvation but for numbness, of the years you lost, to expectations, to roles, to shadows. And then you wrote of the moments that kept you alive. The sound of your daughter's laugh before the world touched her, the way the sunlight came through the high window on quiet mornings, the rare tenderness in another woman's eyes when she knew what you could not say aloud. These were not victories, but they were yours, and for once, your story did not belong to someone else. It was not proof for your husband, not confession for your priest, not instruction for your children. It was yours. And in writing it, something shifted. A seam loosened. A lock clicked. You would not live to see the world change, but you had begun the change within yourself, and that mattered, because every truth spoken, no matter how late, is a spark. And sparks wait. They linger in dust, in corners, in forgotten drawers, until the right breath finds them. And so it was that decades later, your great-granddaughter found the letter. A girl raised in a different time, but not so different. Still told to be small, still praised for silence, still warned that anger was unbecoming. She read your words. She wept. She didn't understand everything, but she felt the weight, the ache, the ember, and she carried it, not as burden, but as torch. She began to ask questions. She refused the easy path. She walked into rooms you had been barred from. She loved whom she chose. She spoke what she believed. And she lived. Not because the world had changed, but because she knew she wasn't alone. She wasn't the first. You were. The forgotten bride who left behind not lace, not jewelry, not recipes, but truth. And perhaps that was the most sacred inheritance of all. Because history is not only kings and battles. It is women who endured, who remembered, who resisted in silence and in song and in shadow. And when you died, there were no statues, no elegies, no grand sermons. But the women who came after, you knew. They knew. And that knowing, that quiet, defiant knowing, is what changes everything. Not in an instant, but over generations. One letter, one girl, one spark at a time, and still your story remains. Not in books, not in churches, but in the marrow of those who refuse to forget. And as long as one woman remembers, one daughter listens, one bride dares to ask, then you are not lost. You are not erased. You are not alone. You are the first note in a song yet to be sung. And perhaps, one day, when brides no longer fear their wedding night, when love is not measured in silence, when choice is not radical but expected, then your story will not be a warning. It will be a memory. A testament, a beginning. And until that day comes, we will tell it again, and again, and again. You have likely heard the phrase, and they lived happily ever after. But in the Middle Ages, those words were never written for women, especially not for brides. The fairy tales came later. The stories of castles and roses and love that conquered all were crafted by pens that had never felt a bridal veil soaked in blood. The truth is far less romantic. The truth is that for most brides, the wedding day was not the beginning of a joyful life, it was the start of erasure. And what made it worse was the illusion that it was sacred. The ceremony was cloaked in divinity. The church stood at its center, blessing the union not as a choice, but as a necessity. The priest spoke of obedience. The guests whispered about dowries. The father smiled with the pride of having passed along his burden, and the bride, usually trembling, often silent, stood still as the words were spoken over her. She was no longer a daughter, not yet a mother. In that moment, she became a thing, owned, defined by another, bound by God, yes, but more so by expectation. And once the ceremony ended, the real performance began. A bride was expected to walk differently. to speak less, to serve more, to smile always. If she cried, it was said she was weak. If she resisted, it was said she was cursed. If she ran, it was said she was mad. And for those few who managed to speak out, who dared to question what was being done to them, there was always one response: silence her. Sometimes gently, sometimes violently, but always, inevitably, the bride was made to disappear into the role of wife. And the role of wife was written not by women but by systems, feudal, religious, patriarchal. And so the rites continued. The bloodied sheets held aloft to prove virginity. The feasts where she was paraded like livestock. The jokes made at her expense. The advice from older women, each one a warning disguised as wisdom. Be patient, they said. He will come to love you. Give him sons, they said, then you will be safe. Don't provoke him, they said. He has a temper. And with each whisper, the walls closed in. The gown became a shroud. The bridal bed a cage. The ring a chain. And still, the world called it beautiful. Songs were sung. Paintings were painted. Legends were told. But none of them captured the quiet horror of a girl being handed to a man she barely knew. Of a body no longer hers. Of a future written in someone else's ink. And what of love? They spoke of it, of course. In ballads. In prayers. But love was a luxury for the powerful. For kings and queens who could defy the rules. For poets who lived outside the law. For the rest, especially for women, love was dangerous. It distracted, it rebelled, it dared to want more, and so it was crushed. In its place, duty, decorum, decay. A bride could love, but only in silence. She could yearn, but only in secret. And if she failed, if she faltered, if she dared to reach for something more, there were punishments. Some subtle, some brutal. A bruised wrist, a locked door, a shaved head, a public whipping, a stoning, a burial, all in the name of morality, all in the name of keeping women in place. And through it all, the rituals marched on. Generation after generation, the same prayers, the same songs, the same sighs behind closed doors, the same screams into pillows, and yet something always survived. A story, a glance, a letter hidden in a wall, a lullaby sung too softly to be noticed by men. These fragments were not enough to undo the system, but they were enough to remember, to remind, that behind every wedding veil in the Middle Ages, there was a face, and behind that face, a mind, and behind that mind, a storm, one that had no name, one that could not be spoken aloud. But it was there, waiting, enduring, and perhaps that is the most horrifying truth of all. Not that the world was cruel, but that it demanded your silence about the cruelty, that it celebrated your suffering as sanctity, that it painted over your pain with lace and lilies, and that even now, when we look back, so many still see beauty where there was only bondage. So many still speak of romance where there was only restraint. But this story is not theirs. It is yours. And in telling it, we begin to see clearly. You might imagine that, with time, things became better. That perhaps by the later centuries of the Middle Ages, the fate of brides softened. But the truth is, custom hardens when left unchallenged. By the 14th century, the bridal rituals were not merely tradition, they were doctrine. And doctrines are designed not to be questioned. A girl raised in the shadow of the church knew her worth before she could spell her name. Her purity was her value. Her silence was her beauty. Her obedience was her salvation. And once her first blood came, she was watched more closely than cattle. Every interaction measured, every glance analyzed. A boy smiled at her in the square. Her mother whispered warnings. A priest noticed her posture. Her father planned dowries. And through it all, the girl remained quiet. Not because she wanted to, but because generations of women before her had taught her what happened to those who spoke. She knew the stories. The girls who dared say no, the ones who fled, the ones who loved in secret. They disappeared. into nunneries, into dungeons, into unmarked graves. So she said yes. She bowed her head. She wore the dress. And on her wedding day, she was called lucky. Even when her groom was older. Even when his breath stank of rot. Even when she had begged for time. Still, the village smiled. The bells rang. The feast was held. Her body trembled, but her hands were held down in prayer. And once the door closed behind her that night, she knew there was no return. The wedding night was not romantic. It was not sacred. It was not even private. Often, servants stood outside the door listening. Sometimes, family waited to inspect the sheets. And the bride? She was expected to perform, not enjoy, not understand, just comply. Pain was considered proof. If she bled, it meant she was pure. If she screamed, it meant she was new. If she was silent, it meant she understood her place. And should she cry in the morning, she was told, "You'll get used to it." But what if she didn't? What if she never did? What if every night after that was a silent endurance? Then she was called cold, frigid, ungrateful, and worse, dangerous. A wife who did not submit risked not only shame, but accusation of witchcraft, of heresy, of disobedience, which in some towns was punishable by flogging, and so she adapted. She learned to smile when it hurt, to serve when she was starving, to kiss hands that had struck her, and always she was told, "This is love, this is marriage, this is God's will." But deep inside, beneath the layers of survival, a quiet part of her remembered. The girl she once was, the dreams she once held, the voice she once had. And in stolen moments when the house was empty, when the wind was loud, when no one was watching, she whispered her own name. Just to remember it, just to feel human. But names were not enough. So she passed on warnings to her daughters, disguised as lullabies, wrapped in fairy tales, stories where the prince was kind but distant, where the bride escaped through cleverness, not charm. And always a lesson, always a riddle, always a seed planted in secret. Because if the system could not be changed in one lifetime, perhaps it could be weakened across many, one whisper at a time, one truth hidden inside a story. One daughter who dared to dream. And yet, for every small rebellion, there were punishments. Some physical, some spiritual. A mother who watched her daughter sent to another village, never to return. A sister who vanished after questioning the priest. A midwife burned for teaching women about their bodies. The cruelty was systematic, and efficient, and public. Because shame was a weapon, and women were made to hold it against each other. "Don't be like her," they'd say. She was too proud. She asked too many questions. She thought she was special. And thus the system fed itself. Women were both prisoners and guards, and brides were the newest recruits. But in the dark, where fires burned low and secrets were whispered between bedsheets and under breath, a different knowledge was kept alive. The knowledge that marriage could be more. That love should not hurt. That obedience is not the same as virtue. That a woman is not a possession. And even if those truths could not yet be spoken aloud, they were known, they were carried, through songs, through glances, through careful hands that held crying brides and said, "I know." It was not enough to stop the machine, but it was enough to remember that it was a machine, that it was not natural, that it was not holy, that it could one day be dismantled. And so the truth endured, wounded, whittled, but never erased. And now we arrive at the end, not of the story, but of its silence. The story of the medieval bride was never truly forgotten. It was just buried beneath centuries of ceremony, beneath the polished words of chroniclers, beneath the wedding veils that shimmered in candlelight but hid the bruises beneath. And now, at last, we speak plainly. The truth is not grotesque because it's exaggerated. It is grotesque because it was so ordinary. Brides were not exceptions. They were the rule. In towns, in villages, in manors, in castles, and hovels alike, young women were sold, blessed, married, used. The church sanctioned it, the state enforced it, families normalized it, and the world celebrated it. The bride became a symbol of purity, and yet was treated as property. The wedding became a ritual of joy, and yet functioned as a contract of ownership. And every piece of it, the ring, the dress, the feast, the prayers, served to disguise a transfer of power. A girl was not asked if she was ready. She was told. Her womb was not hers to guard, her mind not hers to trust, her voice not hers to raise. And still, we hear songs of that time that speak of beauty. We read tales that end with weddings. We visit ruins and call them romantic. But stone cannot tell you what it witnessed. The castle wall will not whisper the names of the girls who wept behind it. The bedchamber retains no sound of the first night's screams. The chapel's silence is not peace, it is a memory too heavy to echo. And so it is we who must remember, not with nostalgia, but with clarity, not with shame, but with justice. Not with horror for horror's sake, but with the resolve to honor what was endured. Because behind every forgotten bride there was a woman, a full, thinking, feeling, dreaming human being, who had fears and hopes and laughter that was stolen too early, and potential that was redirected into survival. And despite all of it, she endured. Not always with grace, not always with success, but with resilience that cannot be measured by Stowe, Rise written by men. So what do we do with this truth? We hold it. We do not flinch. We do not try to soften it with romantic filters or poetic distortions. We say, this happened, it was not right. And it is not forgotten. And if we are lucky, if we are careful, perhaps we can pass along not just the story, but the strength. To every woman who was told her wedding day was the most important day of her life when it was the day her life began to disappear. To every daughter who was taught that her value was in her chastity, not her curiosity. To every woman who dared, even quietly, to want more than a household and a husband and a name carved on a shared tombstone. We speak to you, not to grieve only, but to witness. You were not weak. You were not wrong. You were not alone, and you are not invisible now. Your stories have survived in fragments, yes, but those fragments are enough to reconstruct the cathedral of truth. They are enough to show us the bones of the system, to understand how it was built, to see where it still stands. Because let us not lie to ourselves, the legacy of medieval marriage has not vanished. It echoes in customs, in laws, in ideas whispered from mother to daughter. In the subtle ways society still tells women to be quiet, to be good, to wait. But now we know, and once a truth is known, it cannot be unseen. The bride of the Middle Ages is not just a relic of the past. She is a mirror. She asks us, what have you changed? What have you carried forward without question? What parts of me still live in you, in your world, in your weddings, in your words? And it is for us to answer, to honor not only her suffering, but her stubborn, radiant, unspoken resistance, her breath in the dark, her steps toward the altar, not as a celebration, but as a sacrifice, her prayers not for love, but for survival, and her dignity held even when the world tried to strip it from her. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a tragedy. This is a reckoning, and from it we walk forward, eyes open, ears open, hearts open, and with a vow of our own, that we will remember, that we will not romanticize what was cruel, that we will not celebrate what was control, that we will tell the truth fully, gently, and completely, because the story of the bride deserves no less.